Right now
let's go to Aberdeen and speak to our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, so over the weekend, yesterday, in fact, Nicola Sturgeon told us that she detests Tories. What's she going to say this afternoon?
Yeah, good question. It sparked a bit of controversy that yesterday, didn't it? Some Conservatives thought it went too far. It was kind of too provocative in terms of the language used. Dangerous, I think, was one word that a senior Conservative used to describe that. Nicola Sturgeon had a slightly row back a little bit, suggesting she was talking about Conservative Party policies rather than actual Tories themselves, and also saying it shouldn't come as a surprise that she's not the world's biggest fan of the Conservative Party. Today, though, I think two things. First of all, there is going to be continued emphasis on independence and Scotland's place inside the Union. I mean, it is interesting, having come, as you were there as well, Gloria, at Labour and Conservative Party conference, where the narrative is the cost of living crisis, energy security. For the Conservative Party, lots of infighting. Here, I mean, it really is still dominated by that big constitutional question about Scottish independence and the attempts to hold a second referendum. As you've alluded to there, the Supreme Court tomorrow are going to begin hearings into essentially whether it is up to MSP in Holyrood or MPs in Westminster who has got the ultimate say on if and when a second referendum should happen. In all likelihood, it's likely that the Supreme Court will rule in Westminster's favour. That means no referendum, effectively, even though Nicola Sturgeon has stated she'd like one in October next year. And I think the big question then is, what does she do next? She's talked about trying to turn the 2024 general election into a de facto referendum, though, in the end of the day, that's constitutionally not really going to work. Talking to some people here who suggest it's just political posturing in many ways to keep the SNP relevant in that general election campaign, particularly as support for Labour here has surged somewhat in the last couple of weeks. But also, there are lots of frustrations outside of this conference centre and across Scotland that think that Nicola Sturgeon shouldn't just be talking about Scottish independence, but actually focusing a hell of a lot more on these day-to-day big political issues, like the health service, which is in a pretty dire state heading into, the winter, standards in schools, where there's a mixed picture, to say the best for the SNP in terms of how they've handled the education system, and obviously the cost of living crisis and energy security too. And I do suspect, actually, that Nicola Sturgeon will spend a lot of the speech talking about Scottish independence, a lot of the speech attacking the Conservative Party in their inability, it seems at the moment, to manage the economy well, but also will be drawn into trying to talk about what more the SNP can do in Holyrood to manage the cost of living crisis here in Scotland specifically, and also, frankly, Scotland's future in terms of renewable energy, because they are opening these enormous offshore wind farms that should actually generate a hell of a lot of electricity in the years to come. But at the end, what you find here, frankly, as an outsider's point of view, if you like, when you come to SNP conference, is what you find elsewhere in the UK as well, is that, all the achievements that have come in Scotland in recent years have all been the SNPs, and all the failures are Westminster's. And that narrative certainly has not changed this weekend.
And Darren, very quickly, John Swinney's not going to be releasing his plan for economic independence, i.e. how do they pay for themselves as an independent country, until after this conference. What do we make of that?
Yeah, indeed, there's lots of questions, clearly, about what the SNP would do in terms of the pounds and rejoining the EU, whether that means joining the euro and Bank of England independence and all that sort of stuff. All those questions we had back in 2014. The SNP in some ways felt they almost released too much information during that first referendum, that there's enormous policy documents that people could go through. I think for the SNP, they are trying to thread a bit more carefully, get the steps in order. As I say, this is a very, very long drawn-out process. All I would add is on the immediate budget, and there is going to be a budget here in Scotland in December, we're going to get more details, particularly on taxation, because the Scottish Parliament has got tax-varying powers here in whether they will, for example, implement that lower rate tax cuts that the government of Westminster has promised. Will that happen in Scotland? That'll be an interesting question. But second of all, I think it's just this continued frustration from everyone, weirdly, in this debate about the future for Scotland. I mean, there's frustration here in the SNP about another second referendum. They think they've got a mandate from the Holyrood elections last year, which they won again. Many argue they do have that mandate for a second referendum, so they're frustrated to have one. And then also, there's frustration for people who don't want to have a referendum, who say we should move on from all of this, it's a distraction. So Scotland massively divided, and frankly, massively frustrated too.